This holiday, Raising Cane's is celebrating the 25th anniversary of Home Alone 2.
We did it again!
Hot and fresh, 24-hour marinated chicken fingers with cane sauce are the best way to help you through your busy season. And don't forget to pick up a Raising Cane's gift card and limited edition Kevin Plush Puppy for that special someone in your life. Net Plush Puppy proceeds benefit local pet organizations. Happy holidays from Raising Cane's Chicken Fingers. One love. Get it on Blu-ray, DVD, and digital. Rated PG.
Welcome to the Church of Mavis radio show. It's Friday night, 7:07 p.m. Central. You're listening to United Public Radio, 107.7 FM New Orleans. Let me see here. Quality Kratom, fraction of a price in stores. Go to Taunton Bay Soap Company. I'll spell that to you, www.TauntonBaySoapCompany.com. That's TauntonBaySoapCompany.com. Life is good, but life is better on Taunton Bay. Or you can call 207-422-2895. That's 207-422-2895 and speak to anyone for more information or to order. UFOCongress.com, February 14th through the 18th, 2018. It's International UFO Congress. UFOCongress.com, February 14th through the 18th, 2018. The Ozark UFO Conference is April 13th through the 15th, 2018. Best Western end of the Ozarks Convention Center, Eureka Springs. And let me see, OzarkUFOConference.com, OzarkUFO.com. We have two sites and continuously updating. Also, another announcement. I've been trying to get a new site together for a while for Church of Mavis. And we had a little donation and raised a little bit of cash. I had to use some of that for the URL. And I'd been checking on GoDaddy, and I was like, the prices are outrageous for this. The problem is it was like about $300 every year around this time of year. And this time of year is not the best time for me usually financially. Usually my good times are spring and summer. So I was like, well, this thing's going to go off every year around this time. So I put up a status crying about it. And Andy Colvin, New Saucer Inn, said that he would fund it if we made a section and a place for him to blog post at the site, and then we may be doing some things later to make some revenue with videos and ads and stuff with the guy that's doing the site and everything. But anyway, he basically funded it, so
well, that's cool.
It's taken care of. So that was a good thing because it was driving me nuts. So, but basically, we're going to set him up a table, and he can represent there and blog and stuff like that. And then he gets his gets the word out, so that's good. And then we just paid for it for 3 years, so
that's nice.
About 2000, yeah, it was $288 for 3 years. And who knows, by 2020 we may not even be here. It may be nuclear holocaust.
We all may be dead.
Oblivion.
Yeah. Once net neutrality goes, who knows what's going to happen, you know?
That is just so crazy. I just can't even understand it. I just want to say real quick, lock him up, lock him up, lock him up. Of course, I belong to no political party now, but I've never really liked the right. But I don't like the left. I mean, I guess I'm considered a liberal on some level, but kind of just tired of all the titles and names and directions. It's like I'm just trying to get rid of it, but it's like the liberal thing, it sticks with you. It's hard to get rid of, so I guess it's hard for anyone to get rid of that. You have to do psychedelics or something.
Well, you're not liberal, you're just crazy.
That's right. Do some Terrence McKenna. But,
exactly.
But nonetheless, we're going to do the site and all kinds of plans with it. And I'd like to start doing some news, like video, and I'm getting the cam for I'm going to be on my break. I'm supposed to be getting a webcam so everybody can look at my pretty face on the network, which that should be pretty weird because I look like Uncle Fester, but luckily I have my goatee, so it's not as bad. That's what I would do, is shave off my goatee so I look like Uncle Fester. And I'll have a light bulb, and y'all can watch me on TV with a light bulb. But
well, I guess the rest of us will, like when Jay and I do stuff, we'll just have to stand in with a photo or something.
Yeah. Well, y'all don't really want to be on there. I mean, y'all could if you wanted.
Yeah, I really don't want a camera in my face, so.
I'm only doing it for JoJo. I don't really want to, but I'll do it for JoJo, or he'll JoJo me.
Yeah.
But I probably...
You're the main dude anyway, so.
Yeah. I'll probably be nervous at first, but after a while I won't care. That's how at first I'm real anxious, then after a while it won't be no big deal. You know, I just have to be careful what I do. You can't pick my nose.
You can't like pick your nose or
I can only slightly gorge on marijuana.
Yeah, you can't like scratch yourself in embarrassing places and stuff.
Exactly. I have to be careful. Jim's like, where the hell am I? I got to get out of here. We got Jim Miles here with us tonight from Schiffer Books. Mysteries of Georgia's Military Bases, Ghosts, UFOs, and Bigfoot. That's Jim Miles, and we've had Schiffer on many times. Of course, Paul Eno and Ben were just on, and they got, their book on Schiffer. I love Schiffer Books, and every time Schiffer Books sends you a book, a free bookmark with their book, so no other place does that. That's why I love them. They got good books, too. Good to have you here, Jim. How's it going?
Going very well, Jeffrey.
Great to have you. So, were you born in Georgia? Is that where you're from?
Actually, I'm a native of L.A.
Okay.
Lower Alabama.
Okay, you're from Lower Alabama.
I was born in Mobile, Alabama, and my father worked in an Air Force base there. When I was 12, they closed that base, and we moved to Warner Robins, Georgia, where we have Robins Air Force Base, and I've been here ever since.
Cool. Well, I'm from Georgia, but I've lived in Alabama before, but I'm in the panhandle of Florida now. I'm down here by Panama City Beach and all that stuff, but still representing the dirty South down here. But I lived in Georgia 20 years. That's where I was born. And interestingly enough, I'm not going to get into all my UFO weird stuff, but that's where a lot of my personal weird UFO stuff happened. Out by, I don't know if you're familiar with Hampton Motor Speedway. I used to live out there. I had a lot of weird stuff happen out there that was just bizarro, from seeing craft to weird military coming out like they were some kind of agency investigating the craft that was out there, and somehow it seemed like the crafts were attracted to me, so they sent some kind of unit out to investigate. And one of the things I remember is a silent black helicopter over my house with a cockpit making no noise. And this was after I saw UFOs and been out there looking at them with friends and everything. And the guy was in the cockpit, and he waved at me and the guy mockingly, and that thing shot off. And I ain't never seen nothing. It looked like something out of a sci-fi movie, whatever it was, but it made no noise. And there was a guy in a full uniform, and he waved, like, mockingly, and shot off. And I knew they had come out there because of the UFOs. But luckily they never came to me face-to-face or anything like that, thank God, because that would have freaked me out. But had a lot of stuff happen there. Well, I guess, Jim, give us a little bit of background on yourself for the audience so they know who you are, a little background.
Well, I was a high school social studies teacher for 31 years, and I majored in Civil War history. I wrote a 9-book series about the Civil War and travel guides to that. And then I got tired of doing straight history, and I started into my second specialty. I've been interested in the paranormal since I was a child in Mobile, and I've kind of gone crazy from there. I've got 2 books out called Weird Georgia. I've written 7 books now about ghosts and other paranormal events. That's about it.
And what sparked your UFO paranormal interest? Did something happen to you, or was just something you were interested in? Did something particular, like did you see something, or was just something you always had an interest in?
I have long had an interest in it. I grew up near Strategic Air Command bases, SAC bases, and every day there's a dozen bombers taking off loaded with dozens of nukes, and they go out and loiter, waiting to get the word to go and start World War III. And you can hear them warming up their engines, taking off, landing, just twice a day, over and over again. And this is the late 50s, early 60s. There was a lot of UFO activity, and it occurred to me that if UFOs are from a foreign country or a foreign galaxy, then those are the kind of places they would like to keep an eye on. Now, my only UFO experience occurred on a military site like this. Back in 1960, the government built 90 missile bases around the big SAC bases. And at these 90 bases, they would have 24 missiles. And the idea was, if World War III starts and Russia sends in fleets of bombers to nuke our military bases, the 90 bases were there to intercept them. They had 24 missiles holding either a 2-kiloton or a 10-kiloton nuclear bomb. And the purpose was to launch these off into our own atmosphere and explode them around the invading Soviet bombers and knock them out of the air. So it would have been hard on ourselves, kind of nuking ourselves like that. So we figured that was better than having the Russian bombers land a lot of nukes on our cities and military bases. Here in Middle Georgia, there's a little town called Byron, and that was a location of one of the Nike bases protecting Warner Robins. Right next door to the Nike base is the Boy Scout camp. So it was 1966 or 1967. We were having a fall camporee, and one night the adults went to bed, and all the boys were around the fireplaces just talking about things that interest young teenage boys, which is largely, young teenage girls. And as we sat there around the campfire, we suddenly noticed a large orange object in the sky. We could see the moon. It was somewhere else, but this orange light was nearly as large as the moon. And as we watched it, it swung towards the ground like a pendulum. And each swing, it got lower and lower and lower, and finally dropped behind the pine tree. I never knew what that was all about, but it was certainly unidentified in the sky and mysterious and near two important nuclear facilities. So that really heightened my interest in UFOs.
And did that craft seem to be like energy, or was it solid, or what did it look like? What do you think it was? Was it like an energy spear, or what do you think it was visually?
Visually, it was just a big orange circle. You couldn't tell anything about it physically. It might have been solid. It might have been plasma, who knows what, but it wasn't supposed to be there.
Definitely interesting. You're making me. There was one time when I was down here in Florida, Glen Haven. I walked around the block. This was like 7 or 8 years ago, and I was just walking around the block. And I probably had a dog with me or something, but I saw a big, bright. Well, it wasn't really. It was orange, and it floated over the street, and there was nothing attached to it. Like, first I thought maybe something was carrying it, like a helicopter or something. There was nothing there, but it was silent and quiet. But what was so weird about it is it was like a big metal, rusty, orange ball, but there was no chains. It was just the weirdest thing. It just floated over, and I was just like, what in the hell was that? And it was so close. But, I mean, I started thinking about the orange ball, not saying it's the same thing, but so many weird things. Well, just to briefly tell you my story, when I was 17, I had testicular cancer, And during that time I was dying, and I was in the comic books, I said a prayer to be a superhero. And I was croaking, so I was, you know, at a lot of straws. But I went through chemo. I got healed. I've been healed for about 18, 20 years. I've lost count. And a year or so later, my dad died. And I was like, why is all this crap happening to me at such a young age? And I started reading, you know, the Bible from the front to back, to Buddhism, Druidism, anything I could get my hands on. And I started to attract UFO activity. And it started in Georgia at Hampton Motor Speedway. And it consisted of seeing craft with multiple witnesses, to friends saying, Jeffrey, you're attracting this here. My mother being scared out of her mind, seeing pyramid craft coming out of a hole in the sky. And everywhere I move to, it follows me. And it's not like, I call those sightings my golden oldies, because they're not like, the ones I have now aren't like that. Back then it was like, I mean, something out of a movie. They were so strong and, you know, powerful. But now it's kind of more subtle. Like, you know, some things I've seen now, like I've told this a million times, but I saw two beams of light leave this house a few years ago that just, I went outside, turned towards my house, and it just seemed like two people made of light left my house, and like they had come out of my roof like that. Somehow they passed between the, you know, room here where I'm at to through the roof, and was like they were leaving the house. And that's one of my big ones that I've had a few years ago that I'll never forget. But one thing I've had, I know in your book you talk about Fort Benning, and I've known John Vasquez for a long time, and he's passed away now, but he's been on the show when we first started doing the show, and he used to call me here, and we would talk about UFO stuff. And at the time, I know he kept mentioning some sergeant, and he was like always on the trail of this Fort Benning. Like he was always like a new development. He was like his own little X-Files movie going on. He was always working on trying to figure out something. And he would call, and I don't remember anything like in detail that he would tell me. I just remember mentioning some sergeant, which I can't remember his name. But and the next thing you know, I think I've interviewed him and maybe written too. I'll have to look for that, but I know he's on the show a couple of times. And then I know he passed away, and I didn't even know he had medical problems or anything. I'd have to ask his family to know what really happened, but it was just kind of weird when I had heard that, talked to him, and he was going into all this wild stuff about Fort Benning, and then he passed away. I don't know if there's any connection to that. I wouldn't dare, go to that level, because, it could have been medical. But it was just, I've missed him, and he used to call me all the time. So when I saw him, and I've jokingly said sometimes he stops by, which he could, or it could be delusional. But nonetheless, I know you get into Fort Benning. I'm just kind of curious what your take is on that incident, because this is the weirdest thing. I thought everything from actual UFOs coming and aliens to soldiers being dosed with LSD. There's so many theories about it, and I don't know which one's right. But I'm just kind of curious, what's your take on John in that situation, if you could get into that a bit?
Well, first, I think John died in a car wreck. I think it was a car incident. And I read his book 3 times, Incident at Fort Benning. I wanted to try to clearly understand what he was saying. And one thing I will say about him, never had met him, just read his book 3 times. He seemed dedicated to proving that something happened. I don't know what he did for a living, but this took up a great deal of his time. He was writing, hundreds of letters perhaps. And he didn't get very much in return from the letters that he wrote. And I thought he was too often reaching. He wanted to know about this incident at Fort Benning, but he was contacting the FBI and the space program, and he got a lot of negative information, and it seemed like he accepted this as evidence of a cover-up. Now, his actual story, he suggested that perhaps his incident was psychological or drug-related. But most of his book and all of his evidence, he was concentrating on proving that this was an actual physical event that happened to him and perhaps 2,000 other soldiers at Fort Benning in 1977. I could go along with the drug psychops thing, but I don't think anything physically happened. There's absolutely no evidence that it did. And if thousands of men were involved, surely more than 3 men would come forward with a story relating to the incident at Fort Benning. And, have you discussed what actually happened at the incident?
Yeah, I'm familiar with it on some level, as far as the troops kind of going crazy on some level and seeing a craft and some kind of being. And, I've heard, he's told me the story, but it's been years and years ago, and I haven't really heard it in a while. This is the first time I got a chance to talk about it in quite some time. But the other thing is, when you talk about the possibility of, psychedelics, that stuff can bring on those beings from medicine men and, shamans and stuff we've interviewed. I mean, that kind of stuff can attract all kinds of entities. So, who knows? It's just so weird. But I know a little bit about it, but you probably know more about it than I do.
You might want to give a brief account of it, such as you understand what he said, so that our audience might know what's being talked. I mean, I kind of know about it too, but I wouldn't mind hearing about it again. If you wouldn't mind telling the audience basically what his account was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, John Vasquez wrote in his book, Incident at Fort Benning, that he was at Fort Benning, stationed there in 1977, and that 4 companies of men were on a parade formation, and that something happened in the sky. They saw beams of light coming in, and many men passed out. The other men just went crazy and ran around and hid under the barracks and such. And during this period, he said that he was kidnapped by aliens. It was the typical abduction experience. He found himself in a large UFO surrounded by tables occupied by other human beings. And alien being told him, listen, cooperate and forget. And so next thing he knew, it was morning in the barracks, and the men were all kind of confused. Their watches had stopped at different times. The buttons on their shirts and their trousers were incorrectly aligned. And they just felt kind of strange about it. But they continued on with the new day. And that day they sent John's company out on maneuvers. And the strange thing that happened is when they got out there to where they were going to camp and have exercises, there was a dispute with the sergeant. And so the sergeant left them all alone, which is unusual. There were 300 men there, all enlisted, and they had no leadership above that level. And so there's just started a whole lot of strange things going on. The next morning, they find that there's another company parked across the hill from them, and they're worried about that because these soldiers have live ammunition. And so John organizes his people, and they crash the site and steal the ammunition and various supplies from the other company. There then followed several days of strange things. Vasquez's company were declared renegades, and they took off across the wilds of Fort Benning. And they came to a lake once, which had a prehistoric monster in it, which didn't make much sense at all. But they were chased all over the base, and they stole jeeps and trucks and supplies and food, and just generally went around with no supervision whatsoever except their own. In the end, they surrendered their ammunition, and they came back to barracks. Now, all of that was strange enough, because what John wrote was that he committed, a couple of dozen major military infractions, crimes, which would get you a life in prison, I would imagine. Well, the next morning after they got back, they were out in formation. I'm sorry, it was at night. And that's when the UFO attacked. He said that a UFO showed up and opened fire. The UFO shot beams that knocked down 2 different helicopters. And the soldiers were fighting back. They had M16s and rifle ammunition, and they were working with the tank and the Green Berets, and they were fighting these alien beings. And finally, John was contacted by an alien intelligence, and he was told that he needed to communicate with the general that was there on the scene. And so John became like a medium between the alien intelligence and the general, and that things were worked out apparently. They woke up the next day. A psychiatrist showed up with medicines, interviewed every single man, and wiped their memories. He then was sent to Europe, Germany. They gave him an envelope. He came home with it, with his discharge, and he thought that the secrets of the incident at Fort Benning had been in that envelope, but for some reason he never looked at it. And then he went home and didn't have any memories of these events for, I guess that was 8 years. When it came back to him, and he started writing all these letters to different government agencies and persons, trying to get any kind of official documentation of what happened, but he was unsuccessful. And that's his story in a summary.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I knew parts of that. I didn't realize it was quite that extensive. That sounds like a wild dream.
It does. And that might be the drug thing.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds difficult for me to believe that would have happened in a literal way on a military base. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree with you. He, over the years, 2 other men came forward, 2 men who had known each other from birth in northern Alabama, and they came up with various forms of the same story. And then there was a thing about one of these men said he had metal from the UFO buried on his property, and he was going to release all the information, but it never happened. Then one of the men died of cancer, and the story was that while he was working at Fort Rucker in northern Alabama, that a UFO had come around and shot a beam at him, and within a week or 10 days, he had died.
Something. What were you saying about a prehistoric monster? They saw something in a lake, something that was in a lake, you said?
Yes, they passed through a ravine, and they came upon what was obviously a pond, not connected to the Chattahoochee River, just an ordinary pond, and 30 of them crossed through this pond. As they were doing this, a huge underwater monster began circling them all, faster and faster and faster, creating larger and larger waves. They fired shots into the water. They even threw a couple of grenades into the water to try to drive it off, and they were finally able to escape. And John in the book suggested that this is a prehistoric thing which just pops up from time to time. And to me, that was a bizarre story within a larger bizarre story.
Yeah, that's pretty strange. That's
here's something that's pretty peculiar. During my experiences and during that time, I partied a lot, so I did a lot of crazy stuff. But I also, as I partied a lot, messed with the occult in stupid ways. Just foolish, reading stuff out loud, just stupid things I probably shouldn't have did. And during that time, me and some friends on Halloween night went to a lake. My brother was there. There was this guy my brother's name's Greg. There's another guy named Greg, this really overweight guy that was like taking some kind of speed pills. And he started acting, that night I had seen some beings that appeared very reptilian-like, and it was almost like they were holograms on some level. But that guy that was with us freaked out and acted like he was possessed or something and tried to drive us into the lake. But that night, there was some crazy situation with some kind of something in the lake. And the things I saw there were very reptilian, and I heard a weird music. But what I'm thinking, maybe if it is psychedelics, that there are some people, when they're under the influence of that some indeed beings can be called through that somehow. And maybe they were under the influence, but maybe it kind of summoned those things on some level. I'm not saying that's the absolute answer, but that's kind of something to think about on some level. I'm going to have to read his book in more detail. He's been on the show and talked about it, but it's been so long. I need to get the book and go over that again for sure, no doubt about it. But what was who were some of the other people that came forth about it? They came out publicly about it just as much as he did?
Eventually, yes. First, there was a source called Ocelot, and he told the story that he was there at the incident, and his story was a little different, which, is not unusual for two people in one experience that, experience it differently. And he was the one who said that he had a piece of a UFO, and that he buried it on his property, and it was filled with hieroglyphics, and he was going to bring it out one day. And then a number of black SUVs with the men in black showed up at his home and stared at him for a while. And he decided, no, I'm not gonna announce anything else, because I don't need the additional problems there. His name, it came out, we believe he's named Bobby Garman. And the other guy was a command sergeant major named Norton. And he was also there at the incident and experienced some of it with Bobby Garman. And he is the one that is alleged was killed by the UFO being a number of years later. And that's pretty much it. They never supplied any kind of evidence, although they said that they did, some video, the UFO fragments. But these are the only two people to actually come out and back up John's story.
Definitely a fascinating case, and I'm getting like chills down my spine. I guess this is hitting home a little too much for me, the Georgia situation. There's still some chills going down my body. But so what's wrong with Georgia? I mean, they say the devil went down to Georgia. Did he really go down to Georgia? I'm just kind of curious from your standpoint, why do you think all this happens with Georgia? Is it the bases? I mean, what do you think the root of it is?
I've thought about that a good bit. I like to think that Georgia is really like anywhere else, and if you study it intensely, you'll find the same amount of events that occur there. The thing about Georgia is the largest state east of the Mississippi. It's the 10th largest in population. We have oceans and mountains and swamps and, just everything. And so we have every kind of environment, I think, that's necessary for all the different types of phenomenon to occur. We have a lot of Bigfoot activities. We got vast swamps and river valleys and mountains. We have UFOs visiting all of these military places and the population centers. Well, ghosts are universal. And it seems like they particularly love old southern cities, such as Mobile and Savannah and pretty much all of them. So Georgia just has it all, and it may seem like Georgia has more than usual because I've been studying it intensely my entire life. I just research and gather these stories, and I'm making them public. And people say, that's a lot of books about weirdness in Georgia. And what I can tell you is I've hardly gotten started. I got filing cases full of other types of weirdness, all kinds, actually. And people will continue to reach out and say, hey, I've got a story for you. And I'm learning things every day.
So one thing I'm curious about, when I was talking about my UFO experiences and some kind of situation agency came out in aerial vehicles to investigate, are there any other cases where that you know of where they've come out to investigate, and who do you think it would be that would be coming out? Just the military? Are there any other cases that the military sent someone out like that on some level to investigate? Because it seemed like to me it was like some kind of special weird team that picked up the blips on the radar and went out like that was their sole function. Like that was, so there's a UFO sighting, yada yada yada, send a unit out. That's what it seemed like. I'm just kind of curious, any other stories that come to mind with that type scenario?
No, that's a new one. I wrote that one down. I'm going to be looking into that. I do believe that some people seem to attract phenomena such as UFOs and ghosts and such, and seem to follow them from place to place. But as to being observed because of it, no, but I can see it. A lot of people say that the UFOs and alien intelligences are in cahoots with some level of government. And I guess that would be the men in black sort of thing. So they might have their files on those of us looking into these things. I don't know.
I'm sure they got files on you, Jeffrey. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, since you're doing this public thing. So you talked about this experience that you had, what, in 66, 67?
Yeah.
And that was in Georgia, right? Okay.
Yes.
I just found that really interesting. I'm assuming that you're aware that from about, I guess it would have been about 65 to about 67, 68, that many parts of the Southeast were experiencing clusters of UFO sightings. And so, you seeing it at that time would have fit right in with what a lot of other people were seeing. And the reason I mention that is because my family lived in Chattanooga, Tennessee, during that period, and which, of course, as you probably know, is pretty close to the state line with Georgia. And we would go into Georgia all the time, actually, to visit various historical sites. And that's where I had my pivotal UFO experience as a child. I was 6 years old and had a daylight sighting with a friend. And I just think it's interesting that, and I've encountered a lot of other people from the South that saw really pivotal sightings or interesting sightings right around that same time period. And there's always been this part of me that's sort of wondered whether, there are sort of groups of us that see things at the same time, you know what I mean? And it sort of affects us for the rest of our lives.
Yeah. In 1973, there was a tremendous wave of UFO sightings across the entire country.
Yeah, that's when I had another experience, but it wasn't a UFO sighting, because I happened to be in a different part of the country where they were having cattle mutilations, and I saw a cattle mutilation, the result of one. So, But anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
Okay. I've always been fascinated by the fall of 1973 because it started in Georgia. It started not far from where I was going to college at the time in Americas. And they just popped up in Albany, and they spread across Georgia. I mean, the entire state of Georgia, one place to one place to one place. It's like a disease spreading.
Right.
And they would take up different forms. They got more and more intense. Near Griffin, there were 2 different cases where it seemed like fire fell from heaven and incinerated the earth. And there were giant UFOs around. And near the end, in October, particularly around Athens, we had a number of aliens showing up. I think there were 8 different incidents of alien beings showing up and testified by the people who saw it. And then this phenomenon went worldwide. I've done a lot of research into this, and I plan to write a book just about the UFOs in Georgia from September the 1st through October of 1973. It was just incredible what happened.
That's really interesting because, John Keel, who I'm sure you're probably familiar with, he talks about how sometimes clusters begin like that or flaps begin like that, where they'll start in one place and then they'll just sort of spread out in these different areas, and they'll take related but different forms, and it's almost like it's whatever it is evolving or changing, or just, it is sort of like a weird epidemic. It's very strange. And how does Bigfoot fit into this? These events?
Yeah. Bigfoot, I don't know. Bigfoot's in its own little world there. There's part of me that thinks a real biological creature might be able to exist, and then there's a part of me that says it's ridiculous. We've found no evidence of it. But throughout Georgia, we have a large representation of Bigfoot creatures. Speaking of Bigfoot at military reservations, there was one at Fort Gordon, which is up near Augusta, Georgia. And in 1977, a man was out hunting with his son, and they found a footprint in hard clay. And as well as they could see it, this thing was nearly 20 inches long and 5 inches across at the ball of the foot. And that made them wonder about things. Well, they went about their business. A week later, the father came back to check it out. He went into the area where they'd seen this footprint, and it was a flat ravine. Although in the middle of the ravine, there was a little stream, and it was surrounded by stunted trees and underbrush and such. And he was walking around it and saw a path inside. So he entered this thicket for about 5 feet, and he was confronted by a gigantic Bigfoot. He said this thing was 10 feet tall. I had long, muscular arms and legs, and looked like an ape with a Neanderthal-shaped head and all. And he said the Bigfoot just stared at him. Like, this is my place, you shouldn't be here. And the man said, okay. So he walked out, he backed away from the creature. And nearby, he found where Bigfoot had apparently been very ill. First, he smelled vomit, and he found what he swore was a 3-gallon pile of vomit with large pieces of deer skin and a lot of acorns. And not far from that, he found Bigfoot's stool containing the same stuff. And he told this story in 1977. He used his name at that time, and he still lives in Augusta, and you can call him up and he will still tell you exactly what happened. He was a well-respected soldier and employee of the base, and he's one of the people that you would think would have something to hide, or rather something to lose, by being identified with a story like this. But he said, it happened. I'm going to tell the story. I don't care what people think about it. So that's 40 years he has stuck to that story. That always impressed me.
That's the first. I don't know, Jeffrey. Have you ever heard a story about Bigfoot vomit before? Seriously, that's like a new one. I mean, it lends an air of authenticity to it, probably, But it's like I've heard of stool before. I've never heard of Bigfoot vomit. That's fascinating.
It was funny because Dan was in chat, Bigfoot Dan from Georgia, going Bigfoot, asking about Bigfoot. So you hit the nails through the hands with that one. Yeah, Dan's excited now. Bigfoot and Bigfoot vomit. He's happy. He's breathed with Bigfoot. So I was like, there's a Bigfoot on the cover, man. Come on, you need to get the book.
Yeah, let me tell you this story. In North Georgia, there's a new Bigfoot museum. It's near a town called Blue Ridge, and it's run by a couple that have been in the Bigfoot investigation business for some time. And they have statues and models, and of course they have a lot of footprints and different kind of things. I was there back in the summer, and I nearly fell down when I saw their prized artifact. It's a casting of a Bigfoot butt.
Of a butt?
Bigfoot's butt, yes.
You mean like where a Bigfoot? You mean like the two buttocks?
Yes, like he had sat down and left his impression. Researcher came along and said, let's get some plaster in that thing.
Oh, that's
so they had Bigfoot prints and a Bigfoot butt.
Nice.
That's a big butt.
This is getting out of control here.
And this is near Blue Ridge, Georgia. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, up in the mountains.
Yeah. Okay.
Dan in the chat had seen the Bigfoot butt print.
Oh, did he?
Yep. Wow. We gotta find a picture of that. You need to take a picture of that, Dan. I gotta see that. So, I guess, what are some of the military base stories, or some of your favorites that if you want to get into some of those, some of the other bases that maybe we haven't talked about yet, or that people may not be that familiar with?
Yeah, I'll tell you about 3 UFO stories from here where I live, Robins Air Force Base. People like to think that UFOs are only seen late at night by drunk people. And I've told them, it's people who are out at night. It's firemen, it's police officers, it's doctors, it's EMTs, and, respectable people. And at one Robins Air Force Base, there were 3 UFO sightings by base personnel that were investigated by government agencies, and they were kept confidential for 30 years before they finally released these stories. It started in 1948. The first great southern UFO sighting was when 2 airline pilots were flying between Montgomery, Alabama, and Atlanta. As they flew, a gigantic rocket almost collided with them. And they took evasive action, and they said this UFO was 100 feet long. It had a 40-foot-long fire coming out of the tail of it. We could see a double row of windows. And you could look into it, and you could just see through it to the other side. And these 2 Eastern Airline pilots landed in Atlanta, and they gave extensive interviews about what they saw, and everybody respected it. What people forget is that this plane was heading towards Robins Air Force Base. And 2 hours later, it arrived. 2 different people, military personnel, saw the giant rocket pass over Robins Air Force Base.
Wow.
And as I said, they made statements. It was investigated. This is a government-approved UFO sighting. 2 years later, another UFO visited the base. It was seen by a sergeant and a captain, and they wrote extensive accounts saying this thing was like a giant children's top. It had lights, it was very colorful. It came, it stopped, it seemed to hesitate, it reoriented, and then it disappeared at a very fast rate of speed. And again, these are government documents. A couple years after that, 3 employees of Robins Air Force Base at different places saw a large UFO, which looked like a plane on fire, but it wasn't. It was just a physical object of some kind. And what they found so unusual is that from this UFO, a point of light would reach up into the sky. It would stop, and then the UFO would be raised to the point where the light pointed. And that was the way in which it was accelerating, ascending, 1 piece at a time. And it suddenly just disappeared into the distance. Now, all the witnesses were either military personnel or people who worked on airplanes. Nearly all of them were World War II veterans. Several of them had seen German V rockets taken off from France to land on Great Britain. And these are the kind of sightings that you just can't ignore. You can't make fun of the people who saw these things because they're commanding officers. Majors in the Air Force looked into these stories and said, yes, good men definitely saw unidentified craft in the sky. And I always like to emphasize that most UFOs are seen by perfectly reasonable people with nothing to gain from telling the story, but a lot to lose in terms of respect and all. And, for telling the truth.
Right. Well, and also in situations where they're either daylight sightings or they're seen by multiple witnesses at a time, I mean, that's part of the reason why, even in my own mind, when I have doubted what I saw when I was a kid in '67, I saw it with another person. I mean, there was another person who was with me who was older than I was, and in a much better position to be able to identify what it might or might not be, and they saw it too. And so, so I know that I saw something that was unidentifiable. So, it's you have to believe that something is being experienced. So.
Right. Well, in Savannah, there's a large infantry base called Fort Stewart, and near Savannah is Hunter Army Airfield, which is the airfield for the large fort. And this is another story from 1973. When the UFOs spread to the Savannah area, one night there were 2 airmen, MPs, specialists 4th class, and they were on patrol, just going around the perimeter road, making sure there were no intruders, making sure there's no problems of any kind. And they saw a UFO appear in the sky. It was multicolored, and the lights changed regularly, and it flew off. And they thought, that's interesting. They kept on driving around the base, and a couple minutes later, the UFO was back and buzzed them no more than 20 or 30 feet above their car. They were so startled that the vehicle left the road, fell into a ditch, and got stuck. Well, the UFO just stayed there in the sky like it was watching them as they hurriedly got out and dug out the tires, and they finally got the car back on the road. And they went back to their headquarters with the UFO following just a few feet away. They went inside and they made their report. Hey, you're not going to believe what happened, but this is it. And so their superiors are thinking, okay, that's interesting. We should make a report about this. But, we ended that big UFO study, Project Blue Book, so we don't really have a form for you to fill out to describe this UFO sighting. So finally they were told to just take a typical accident report and fill it out and fill in the UFOs and running off the road and all. So the story came out, and it was a big deal. Here were 2 military policemen, very serious young men, well-trained and disciplined, who told the story about the UFO that nearly attacked them. The story came out. The newspapers all wanted to hear more about the story, and that's when the strange things really started happening. first, one of the MPs said, well, we didn't really get stuck. We didn't get stuck. We didn't have to dig our way out. Okay. Next day, a superior officer said, well, they didn't really run off the road either. That's, don't think that happened. And then the MPs told newspapers, we'll interview, we'll be interviewed, we'll answer questions about this. And then they canceled those. And then the military said, well, things have changed. They could talk, but they can't talk now. And newspapers weren't real happy about that. So a day later, the military said, okay, we're going to make these young men available for interviews. And nobody could find them because they had given leave and had taken off for parts unknown. So there's the UFO story along with the typical bureaucratic nonsense that often gets involved in it.
Right. Right.
Well, we're waiting for the break. I'm waiting for the JoJo. We're going to go on break.
Okay.
So they should appear very shortly. Let me go ahead and do the call sign. You're listening to United Public Radio, 107.7 FM, New Orleans. There he is. I was telling Dan in the chat room, and Joe, you need to hear this. Check out the new Western on Netflix called Godless. 7 episodes, miniseries. Jeff Daniels is the villain, and he should win a freaking Grammy or something. It's so good. The best Western TV show since Deadwood. They're bringing back Deadwood, finally, idiot. It's about time. But anyway, we'll be back very shortly. See you in a few. Break. Welcome back to the Church of Magus Radio Show. You're listening to Public Radio 107.7 FM New Orleans. I was just telling Joe and Dan about a show on Netflix called Godless. It's Godless, a new Western. I think it's just a mini-series. I don't think there's going to be a second season from what I've read. They're just going to start doing mini-series. But best Western I've seen since Deadwood. Jeff Daniels is a mean villain. And I've never seen Jeff Daniels play a villain before, but he should win an award or something. He's a real jackhole. But nonetheless, check out Godless. I just want to plug it. But I wish they'd make a second season. But, I mean, it's fine if they don't. Because usually the first season of stuff's really good and then it goes downhill. So maybe it's good that they don't make any more seasons of stuff. But, you watched that, JoJo. JoJo said he loved Westerns when he was a small lad. So I'm trying to give him back his boyhood pleasures. But nonetheless, got Jim Miles here with us, Mysteries of Georgia's Military Bases, Ghosts, UFOs, and Bigfoot from Schiffer Books. Someone had a question to see if you were familiar with this story. Asked the guest if he's familiar with the strange lights and Bigfoot creatures that were supposedly seen by a rescue military unit recovering bodies from a downed military helicopter crash in North Georgia. Does that ring any bells at all?
Yeah, that's a Bigfoot hoax kind of thing. What you do is you take a real incident, something that actually happened, and then you add something to it. Now, in reality, there was an Army exercise in the mountains of North Georgia, in the General Dahlonega area, and there were two attack choppers exercising against each other, and there was a mechanical malfunction on one of the choppers, and it crashed into the mountain and burned. Well, the story came out from an anonymous person that said that he was an MP, and he was in charge of a group of men who went up there in the mountains to protect the site through the night, and that the bodies of the pilot and co-pilot would be recovered in the morning. They were sitting around the campfire. Darkness is falling. After a bit, they hear noises. They hear metal shrieking and being torn and thrown around. And then I heard a couple of unearthly howls and screams. So they all draw their pistols, and one of them flicks his flashlight up. And it's a family of Bigfoot, apparently. 3 Bigfoots, different sizes, and they were trying to recover the bodies of the pilots, apparently, for dinner. And so these airmen all opened up, and the creatures disappeared, and there was no blood trail that they had shot it or anything. And then the next morning, the Army showed up and took the bodies away, which is really a distasteful kind of story to tell. A couple years later, a real MP who had been in charge of that recovery, when they arrived before night fell, the bodies had been recovered. They helped load the bodies into a helicopter, and they were evacuated out. And so the real MP said, "This is absolute nonsense. It's garbage. It's disgusting." And of course, some people believed it. Hopefully, they don't believe it anymore. But that's one of those stories that can get started.
Yeah, Dan asked that, and he knew that it wasn't real, so he was like trying to test you, and you put the smack down.
Okay.
You knew the truth of it. You knew it. Oh, what was that? You still there?
Yeah.
I heard a weird beep on my phone. I don't know what it was. But it was a beep I'd never heard before. Dan was asking, are there any alien abduction stories that in your book from Georgia where people have been, other stories where they've been taken?
I tell a lot of those stories in a 2000 book I wrote called Weird Georgia. There are no real alien abduction stories from the military bases, at least when I wrote the book. A few months ago, I saw a reference to an article that happened just a few miles from here, where I live in Warner Robins. And the story the woman told was she and her son were driving a car, and they were being followed by her husband and a daughter, and they were heading down from South Carolina to Florida to a new house. And the woman suddenly found herself driving around an empty area with lots of big buildings and pavement, and she had no idea where she was. And then suddenly she was confronted by alien beings, big bug people. And what really bothered her is that the aliens were freely associating with Air Force officials on the base. And then suddenly she found herself back on the highway, and this started a lifetime of encounters with alien beings, which is quite extensive. But it is disturbing that there's a military connection here with supposedly the military men in black cooperating with the aliens and abducting and conducting experiments on human beings.
So do you plan to do anything for any other states, or why Georgia so much?
Well, I decided to just specialize in what I know. I could do regional books or national books, but I'm a good Georgian, and I decided to just, you can really specialize or you can generalize, and I like the idea of becoming people call me the Weird Georgia guy. I also wrote the book called Weird Georgia, and that's pretty much what I do these days.
Nice.
So have you personally heard any reports or received any reports from anybody about dogman sightings? Because I know Lon Strickler is collecting right now some dogman sightings from northern Georgia. So I didn't know if you had run across any of those in your research.
I have a small file, but I haven't looked into it in depth, and there's nothing I can really tell you about it.
Okay.
I was excited a few years ago. We finally found a Mothman story from northern Georgia. Yeah, this woman was driving down a mountain road, followed by her aunt and another vehicle, and suddenly the woman, something crashed on top of her car, dented in the top and cracked her window, and she screamed to a stop, just hit the brakes, and this being was thrown off the roof and into the ground, the pavement ahead of her. Her aunt came up with a shotgun, and they investigated, and they said that what rose up from the ground was a Mothman. Stereotypical big man, big wings, no real head, just two red eyes glowing from its middle shoulder area. They were startled and watched it.
And where was this?
This is in northern Georgia.
Okay.
Yeah, no location was given except for northern Georgia. Well, the Mothman recovered and flew off, and they thought, well, that was strange. And they continued to the aunt's home where they both spent the night. In the morning, they went outside, and they found that their big dog had been ripped to pieces by some wild animal. And they could only wonder that perhaps Mothman was ticked off about being hit or by hitting them, and followed them and took it out on their dog.
Wow. Mothman in Georgia. That's the first I've heard Chicago. That's my first Mothman in Georgia. It's interesting because that's an interesting case, Mothman. But it's one of my experiences in Georgia when I was talking about seeing some type of reptilian type beings, and they seem like holograms, but it seemed like one had seemed like tentacles on its head or something. But it was interesting because I came across from Albert Rosales runs a humanoid group. He collects all these stories, and there were other sightings of something that seemed like it had tentacles on its head and all over the Bible Belt. So that was kind of creepy when I'd seen something like that, and then you come across these other encounters of the same weird thing running around. But definitely pretty interesting. I'm noticing here in your... go ahead.
You mentioned the tentacle head. In 1973, when they had all the UFO sightings, there was a student at the University of Georgia in Athens with the unusual name of Mars Walker. He was studying late one night, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning in October of 73. And through his window shades, he saw a very bright, strangely swirling light outside. So he went outside in his apartment balcony, and he saw this really strange UFO. It seemed to be as much vegetation as a mechanical thing. And as he watched it, a being that he could see the outline of in the ship, it was slowly beamed down to the ground. And it was a humanoid, but it had a number of tentacles coming out of its head.
Oh, gosh.
And he had on a belt. It was like an equipment belt, I guess like a Batman utility belt. And it used its tentacles to manipulate these dials and switches and such. And Mars Walker believed that it was taking readings of its environment. After about 15 minutes, it sort of beamed back up into its vegetative spaceship and disappeared.
Trippy. That's for sure. Some of the things that I saw that looked like that, the closest thing that I've seen to them is I had like these oracle cards, and it's the Mayan like oracle, and it has these like pictures of wooden glyphs of their gods. And I was looking through them, I was like, man, this looks like those. Like they look like Mayan gods or something. That's what they look like. But you definitely giving me the willies tonight with a bunch of stuff. Another one I'm remembering in Georgia at that Hampton house, me and this guy named Brian were out in the back looking in the woods, and we saw these little cloaked beings that were very small, maybe a couple of feet, and they almost, well, they kind of looked like Jawas from Star Wars. That's what they looked like. Not exactly, but it was like they had the cloak, and they were small, and you could tell that, you know, their face was inside the cloak, but they were standing around a little black box. And we were both like, do you see that? He goes, yeah, do you see that? And we had to both acknowledge that we were seeing this weird thing. And then I had a cat that came and pounced, and they vanished, a black cat. Later I found that black cat that got hit on the road by a car. His name was Manson. I was in the Maryland Manson back there. I know. But nonetheless, we saw these little beings in there around the black box, and everyone asked me, what do you think the black box was? I have no idea. I guess some kind of technology. And, I mean, they vanished. That cat jumped, and they just vanished out of thin air. So it's like they were on another frequency or something like that. I know I've seen those Stephen Greer, those, I don't know, I'm kind of on the fence how I feel about him, but I know he was parading around that little bitty alien, and I always said, well, if you put a cloak on that thing, it probably looks like that, but I don't know how I feel about that. There's so much mummy debauchery in the alien film that I don't know how to react to when someone shows alien mummy things. I'm like hoax probably, but I don't know. But have you ever come across any little cloak beings at any time? Does that ring a bell, any cases like that?
We had a strange case in southwest Georgia about 40 years ago. A couple were coming home from the big city, going out to their rural home. And it was late at night, and it's very quiet and dark and deserted, no lights around. And as they rounded a bend in the road, they saw a number of figures in a field. These look like they were small figures, maybe children, and they seemed to be dancing crazy-like. Very unusual gyrations they were doing. They were absolutely naked, and when the couple turned the car lights on to them, the figures just scurried away, and nobody has seen or heard of this since.
Weird. So it's like naked aliens dancing?
or like little people. Little people.
Yeah,
that's interesting for sure. No doubt. Now I got that visual. Man, I'm going to be able to sleep tonight.
Yeah, these are really interesting stories.
Yeah, very unique. I mean, I got to give you credit. These are a bunch I've never heard, except from when I've read your book, but I read it when I first got it, and I forget stuff, so you're reminding me of a lot of it. I got to get your weird Georgia books, too, because they seem like they'd be very fascinating, for sure. And it's weird because, getting into the Georgia topic, because I've had so much weird stuff happen there, so it's kind of like Georgia's haunting me, this show. Go away, Georgia. No, I still love Georgia, but I'm in Florida now. The Amazon. I moved to the Amazon.
So what about ghosts? What about ghosts? What's a good ghost story?
I'm glad you asked that. Every military base, getting back to the book, has sightings, ghost sightings, but Fort Benning has like 80% of all the ghost sightings at military installations in Georgia. It's an enormous military base. It's as large as several Georgia counties. They have been training men for the military since World War I. Hundreds of thousands of men have been trained, and they've gone off to fight in World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the more recent terrorist conflicts. And unfortunately, a lot of these men never come home. And it seems like that they return to perhaps the last home that they knew, or the last place that they were happy or with family. And it seems like a lot of the military housing at Fort Benning are thoroughly haunted. One thing about them that's almost universal, these people talk about hearing ghostly footsteps. Fort Benning, they do not have ghostly footprints. They have big thudding boots that just stomping through the houses. That's like a big man coming in from training, and thousands of people have heard these big boots just stomping up and down the stairs and around the house. There's been very few ghosts actually seen. It's just ghostly activity. And usually, these ghosts are only seen by women and children. That's because the men are so often on duty around the world, and the family is left there all alone. And it's some of the ghosts, they seem to prey upon women. They seem to victimize them. Although there's one or two ghosts that actually they seem to be protecting the inhabitants of an area. And usually when the soldiers get home, the ghosts will quiet down for a while. And their wives will tell them stories, and, these big, bad, brave soldiers don't believe that kind of stuff. And then something will happen. And the women are always gloating because, Sam came home. He didn't believe me. Then that ghost showed up and it scared the crap out of him. And that's the kind of thing that you have in military bases. The best story I've heard from Fort Benning, a family moved into a house, and there were unusual things, usual paranormal fare. There's footsteps and doors opening, cabinets closing and such. But after this one moved in, her blood count dropped dramatically. And she went to the hospital, and they said, you need an emergency blood transfusion. And this went on for 6 months. Every time she went back home, her blood count would get lower and lower and lower, and she would have to go back to the hospital for emergency transfusions. She tried to stay outside as long as she could, but she had to go inside for winters. And this went on for 6 months. She nearly died from it all. Finally, they were transferred, and the woman took her medical records with her, and she said it was as big as the New York City phone book. But in the new post, her blood was back to normal and stayed that way. And she believes that it was caused by the spirits that inhabited their house.
Huh. That's wild. That's great. So are these types of hauntings or experiences, are they just sort of common knowledge at places like Fort Benning? Do people just like accept that people are having these experiences?
Well, of course, the military is a very professional, very serious career. So
right.
The military tries to ignore it, but the people know. They talk. They connect with Facebook and other means of communication, and they say that they often go to the housing authority and complain about these things, but nothing is ever done about it. But many families come and go, and they have a network of friends, and they tell people, do whatever, don't let them put you in this house or this apartment building.
Right.
So they know. It's common knowledge among the families there that the military just doesn't believe in ghosts or anything like that.
Or that they just don't officially do. I mean, the reason I say that is because I taught at the Naval Academy in Annapolis for, I don't know, about almost 5 years. And, there's the official sort of military veneer about everything. You know what I mean? It's like no one's going to officially say anything about, anything that's odd or paranormal, or even some things that are just odd and should be reported, like sexual harassment and things like that. But after being there for a while, I became familiar with the fact that there are several places on that base that are considered to be haunted, and it was just something that it was like the people that worked there, even the military
Hello?
people that worked there. Yeah, I'm here. Even the military people that worked there were aware of these stories, and even believed some of them. You know what I mean? But it wasn't something that was officially said. Like in the dorm, students were told, if they were staying up late at night to study, not to study in certain places, and stuff like that. Or there were I was warned about because sometimes I worked on the weekends there, and I would be there mostly by myself sometimes in my office with just the sentries around. And I was told not to go down in certain parts of the building that I was in. There was a part of the building that I was in that houses a museum, where there are like flags and, there's like, for example, the flag that flew over Baltimore during the War of 1812 is there. The Battle of, that the Star-Spangled Banner was written about is there. And so I was advised not to go into certain parts of those corridors by myself if no one else was around, even during the day, because there were weird things that would happen to people sometimes. And they didn't mean, like I would be snuck up on by a stalker or anything, So I figured that probably some of the military people know, and it's just not official that they know,
Yeah. I've been gathering stories from Georgia colleges about ghosts for years, and every student knows the school is haunted, and they can tell you where to go and, what to wait for and such. But then I talked to the administration, and they said, don't you publish anything weird about our school. There's nothing to it. We're a serious scholarly institution.
Right.
And it's
exactly.
a good disconnect between the students and the schools.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I figure that especially, you know, like older bases. I mean, like Annapolis has been around for, you know, that military installation has been around since, or portions of it, since the early 19th century, you know. And so it makes sense to me. And there are lots of things that have happened there, you know, like when the Civil War started, there was Abraham Lincoln sent a flotilla there to seize the base so that he could, you know, suspend the writ of habeas corpus and take control of the Maryland Assembly, Legislative Assembly, which is, you know, just literally only about, you know, a mile and a half from the base, so that Maryland couldn't secede from the Union. And that was like, you know, that's almost like a haunted spot. I mean, they actually have the place where the federal troops landed, the flotilla. It's actually like there's like a big sign there, you know what I mean? And it's just interesting. There's, you know, when you have these kinds of historic spots like that, where either lives have been lost or there's just been a lot of emotional intensity kind of attached to it, there seems to be residual energy that hangs out, I'll put it that way, and then it manifests in various ways. But my students knew all about it, and I just remember one time, one class, I taught history there, world history, and one class I don't know how we got started on the topic. I know we were supposed to be talking about China, and we did talk about China some, but somehow we got onto ghosts and ghost stories, and so the students told me several ghost stories from the dorms, and it was interesting. And of course, you know, I have these stories, but I'm not supposed to publish them either, you know, because it's the Naval Academy. So we don't want to be superstitious.
Well, let me tell you about George. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's funny how, you know, humans live with this stuff, you know. We have these experiences and we live with this stuff, and we don't want to, sometimes we just don't want to admit that it occurs, you know, officially. But anyway, go ahead. Tell your story.
Georgia has a lost nuclear weapon.
Right, I know that, yeah.
Okay. In 1958, a jet bomber took off from Florida with a nuclear weapon, and there's arguments over whether it contained the trigger or not, or whether it could actually explode or not, but it was fully loaded with plutonium, and it bombed, it simulated a bombing run in Virginia. And on the way back home, the jet was bounced by a flight of fighters from Charleston, South Carolina. And one of the fighters, their radar misfired, and it impacted the bomber. The fighter pilot had to eject and floated to a rest in a swamp in South Carolina. The bomber was heavily damaged, but the pilot felt that he could land the plane. But he had to dump the nuke because if he landed and that nuke broke loose, it would just kill everybody in the plane. So he jettisoned it just over the ocean and made an emergency landing at Hunter Army Airfield in Savannah, for which he received a medal. It was one heck of a landing. Immediately, everybody shows up to search for this bomb. It's a nuclear weapon. It was state of the art. And so they had the general area where it probably was. They searched for 2 months, every way imaginable, and they couldn't find it. And the weapon was declared irretrievably lost. Through the years, people have looked for it. The government's done so, I think, 3 times. And then people with a hobby boat will go out there and they've got their own special theories and they're trying to find it. And occasionally they say, we found it. It's under 15 feet of silt at the bottom of Wausau Sound. But the government still declares that it is irretrievably lost. Now, speaking of junk news, I saw this article a few months ago. The headline was, "Bomb Found and Recovered." And they had a picture of a big bomb being hoisted out of the water by a boat. And so I thought, I would have heard of that already. And so I checked it out, and the story was just made up. And the photograph came from Germany, where there were people who were still trying to retrieve 500-pound bombs from, the waterways of Germany there. But today it's that this nucleus is still considered irretrievably lost. And of course, what people worry about is terrorists bringing the bomb up and using plutonium to make dirty bombs out of. There's no way it's going to explode, but a dirty bomb would be bad enough. So that's one of the very few nuclear weapons actually declared lost by the U.S. government.
That's just terrifying. Lost.
Yeah.
You do ask yourself, how could they lose a nuclear weapon? Oh, well.
That just happens, usually collisions in the air. There's a big one in the late 60s off the coast of Spain, and there were several they never found.
Oh.
That's definitely true. My Bluetooth died, so I had to go to my phone manually, unfortunately. But one question I wanted to ask Jim, have you heard any stories about beams of light at all on any of your story gathering? Because that's one of the big things that I see a lot now, more than anything else. Or beams of light for some weird reason. For a while I thought I was dying and I was seeing into the world or whatever, but I never died. Still seeing them. But I'm just kind of curious if you come across any stories on anything like that.
Here's an interesting story from LaGrange in the west central part of Georgia. A woman was out driving one night back in the 1980s, and she saw something in the sky. She really couldn't make out much detail in it, but it was beaming down on a number of ridges. It was like the aliens had decided to barcode part of the Georgia landscape over there. And she cannot think of any reason why that might be happening. I think that's the only light beam story I'm familiar with.
Nice. Definitely interesting. I've talked to different people about them, and I've heard everything from E.T. to Angel to us without our bodies, and I think maybe possibly it's us without our bodies. That's what I kind of personally think, but I guess that could be all of the above as well. It's always good to hear obscure stories of light beam situations. But I've never seen those little gray aliens ever. If I had to pick what being I'd like to see, it wouldn't be a beam of light probably. It'd be something weirder, but never seen a gray. Are there any stories where there have been grays, like just the plain garden variety, big eyes situation?
Yeah, in the 1980s, there were a lot of stories out of west central Georgia. And there was a researcher named John Thompson who did an intense investigation of many different types of phenomenon over there. And he recounted many stories of grays, usually in connection with UFOs and people being abducted. In Georgia, in the last few years, it seems to be a wide variety of aliens. Not so many grays, but just a whole catalog. Before the movies started coming out, always showing grays, America's aliens took all types of forms of creatures. And I think now that might be taking place again, that people are seeing a wide variety. It's made me wonder how many different species of aliens might be creeping around here, looking into things. Or is it one giant federation that they all belong to, or they got a union, or are they just tourists taking the great tour,
It's like, here's the planet. Here's the planet you want to avoid. Here's why. Everybody's checking us out.
Yeah, I've wondered if they're in. Go.
Well, I hear stories about the Greys all the time, but I've never personally seen one, not to discount anything else's, but I've also wondered if it's like an energy that takes form of what you know. Like, for instance, we talked about that trickster energy, and if people know that gray alien particular form from movies and, it's all in our culture, then will that energy appear as what they're familiar with? Like, for me, it could be light beams. For someone else, it could be a gray alien. There's all kinds of theories about that, for sure, no doubt about it. I'm kind of curious. I always love American Indian stories with paranormal. Are there any that come to mind that you can think of from Georgia, or anything that you know from American Indian type situation?
I found a good one from Carrollton, Georgia, a few years ago. There was a boy. He was becoming a teenager, becoming a bit rebellious. That period when he's trying to find his own way. And some type of being picked up on him, feeling that he was vulnerable to approach. And at first it comforted him. And he looked forward to it arriving and helping him feel better about things, feeling superior, a little knowledgeable, more confident and such. As time went by, he realized that this being, this energy, was trying to take over his life, of being his soul. And then one night he came home, went into his room, and he was just enveloped by it. And he knew this was the end, and he was fighting and screaming, and his mother came in and rescued him. That night, several times, the being tried to take him over again, and it turned out that the boy's mother was American Indian, at least half Native American. And at one point in the night, she just stood up and became a warrior. And the boy swore she transformed. She looked, say, a Native American Xena the warrior. And she did spiritual battle with this evil being, and eventually it left him and never returned because of her use of her Native American heritage.
Those are definitely always the best American Indian stories. That's where you can really get the experiences. It seems like a lot of those aren't. We've had a lot of American Indians on about, we've had already Six Killer Clark about Star People and Native American stories, her book, and that's just definitely a great source of knowledge where you can, find out the truths of this stuff, because it seems like not everywhere else, but in a lot of places it's just fear, fear, fear. And that's a culture, the American Indians have dealt with this forever. I mean, they have folklore about it. They have folklore about Bigfoot, the hairy man, and all that. So, I mean, it's something they've passed down. So it's always good to get those stories, for sure. So what is your book that you're working on now? It's just a Georgia UFO book?
I've got several projects going. I'm retired now, so I just piddle here and there, and eventually something develops. My wife and I have been big fans of Georgia state parks. There's a lot of them in every part of the state, and some historical, some scenic and all. So I have been gathering weird stories from all of these state parks in Georgia, which the state of Georgia is not real happy about. They don't want you to think there's something weird going on in their family-friendly parks. But people who go there tell the stories anyway. And sometimes people who work there will tell stories that they're not supposed to. For example, in South Georgia is the site where Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, was captured at the end of the Civil War as he fled, hopefully to the Trans-Mississippi or Cuba or someplace. The night that he was captured, two different units of Union cavalry showed up. And they both knew that Jefferson Davis was there and they were going to pounce at dawn. But these units didn't know each other were there. And so when they launched their attack, they found resistance. But it wasn't the Confederates. They didn't fire a shot. They just gave up. But these Union soldiers were killing each other. And there were several friendly fire casualties here weeks after the Civil War ended. I talked to Daniel Gray, who was the manager of the park down there, and he said he's woken up at night many times hearing gunshots. And it's a rural area, and he's very concerned that somebody might be hunting on, state park land. And he always goes out there. He hears the shots. People in the whole area are familiar with it, but there's no hunters out there. And these sounds come from the exact spot where the Union troops were fighting each other. Another story I like from him, they moved into a house there on the park, Jefferson Davis State Historic Site. And he woke up one night and heard somebody walking back and forth in front of their house. In front of the house, they had a gravel garden there, and he could hear these steps just crunching through the gravel. He decided, I'm just going to ignore that. A few nights later, his wife woke up, and she heard footsteps crunching up and down, back and forth in the gravel out front. And they finally confessed to each other that they had both heard this phantom sentry walking his beat outside their house. So several times, the manager would sneak out at night when he heard the footsteps, and he would make his way slowly around the house, and he'd be watching the gravel as the footsteps continued. There's just nothing there. He said, I'm a little embarrassed to tell you, but what I did about this situation, I took out all the gravel and put pine bark in its place, so if he's still out there marching back and forth, at least we won't hear him.
Yeah.
Well, we got about, we're supposed to be closing out very soon. Let me go ahead and do the plug, and then you're listening to United Public Radio, 107.7 FM New Orleans. Coming up next, Supernatural Substation. Jim, do you have a website you'd like to give out?
No, just my, the author page on Amazon.
Okay, so just Jim Miles, and the book is Mysteries of Georgia's Military Bases, Ghosts, UFOs, and Bigfoot. Been great, man. It's always good to hear unique stories and never heard before, because, of course, there's so many stories that when you do radio, you hear them over and over and over. It's good to hear new ones that you're not familiar with. That's always a treat. So definitely keep us in the loop. And it's been great. We really appreciate you doing the show, and keep us on the loop on that next book for sure.
All right, Jeffrey. I appreciate being with y'all tonight.
Oh, yeah, the stories were great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Have a great weekend. Take care. All right. Everybody, make sure you check out UPRN YouTube channel, iHeartRadio. Also, check out JoJo's Cam when you can. You're in for a treat, a delicious treat when you view JoJo's Cam. Also, remember, lock him up.
Okay.
Remember, lock him up. Pure Trumpelgooch. Lock him up. Good night, everybody. See you next week for Ghost of the Civil War with Rich Newman.
Oh, and since I won't be on the air before the holidays, Merry Christmas to everybody, and have a good time.
We'll be back January 12th. We got 2 more shows left. Good night, everybody. Good night. Bye-bye.
Jeff voted for Trump. I slipped that in on you, baby. Now they're going to think you voted for Trump, man. They're going to be oh, my God, Jeffrey voted for Trump.
This holiday, Raising Cane's is celebrating the 25th anniversary of Home Alone 2.
We did it again!
Hot and fresh, 24-hour marinated chicken fingers with cane sauce are the best way to help you through your busy season. And don't forget to pick up a Raising Cane's gift card and limited edition Kevin Plush Puppy for that special someone in your life. Net Plush Puppy proceeds benefit local pet organizations. Happy holidays from Raising Cane's Chicken Fingers. One love. Get it on Blu-ray, DVD, and digital. Rated PG.